All right, so good morning once again, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to session 2. This presentation is entitled Literature and the Interior World. My name is Professor Kat McDonald, and I am the coordinator of the Monroe College Honors Program, but I am also the immediate past president on the NRHC Executive Board. So I've been serving the board for 4 years. So this morning's presentation, we have 3 amazing presenters for you. I'm going to introduce them so you guys can wave when I say your name. So we have Annie Vasquez from Monroe College. She will be doing a presentation entitled Literature and Life, a Psychoanalysis of Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. Our second presentation will be by Samantha Paucar from Macaulay Honors College, CUNY School, and her presentation is entitled More and Still More, Transcendent Devotion in Wuthering Heights. And then our third presenter this morning is Kylie Gemeasky from Siena College, and her presentation is Living Statues and Collapsing Kingdoms, Shakespeare and the Forgotten Epidemic. So we have 3 awesome authors, 3 different works of literature and bodies of literature to look at this morning. So I'm going to turn it directly over to Annie. To my participants, I want you guys to contemplate questions, and please definitely use the chat before we close the session this morning. Think about connections between the presentations. Perhaps think about our theme of infrequently asked questions, and I look forward to hearing your presentations this morning. So Annie, you have the floor. You can share your screen, and I will begin monitoring your time once you begin. So whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Professor McDonald, and I want to say welcome to everybody else who is joining us here for these amazing presentations that we're about to watch. As Professor McDonald said, my presentation is on the psychoanalysis of Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. Now, The Metamorphosis is a short story that portrays a life of a man who financially provided for his family and became unable to sustain them once he became an insect. Gregor Samsa, our protagonist, when now converted into a large insect, fights psychologically with thoughts of guilt and failure of his family and his unavailability to sustain them, and shows a great indifference towards his feelings. Thus, Gregor's psychological journey begins as he explores his insect state to fights to keep himself as human as possible. There we go. Initially, the story is based off the metamorphosis of Gregor, but Kafka not only unravels the metamorphosis of Gregor, but also unravels the metamorphosis of a family unit. Throughout the story, we can observe Gregor's metamorphosis in respect to Kafka's consciousness. We observe the human desires portrayed through the literature and the significance of Gregor's death as well. As Gregor Samsa woke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. The story begins with this amazing, weird quote. This is not unusual of Kafka to begin a story such as this, like that. In the initial moments of the story, we see Gregor waking up, and he looks at his body immediately in awe and is confused about why he turned into an insect. He quickly dismisses that and thinks about his job and if he's going to be able to go into work that day. And he stresses over the fact about how he's going to pay for things now with him not being able to work, since he is the only person working in his family, since his mother and father have now retired and his younger sister is too young to work. So now, the main question that I asked myself while reading this literature was, why is the metamorphosis of Gregor significant? The shift that happens in the beginning of the story, we don't see the before of Gregor. We don't see his life before he was turned into an insect. We see just when he was turned into one. So what does it mean? So basically, this represents the superego restraining Gregor from having a life and family of his own. Gregor subconsciously believes that he's guilty in the eyes of his father, and this is portrayed through the metamorphosis, and he should be punished for it. The superego serves as a censor, the functions of the values of family and society, being the source of the guilty feelings and fear and punishment that Gregor feels towards his father. Apart from this, the shift that happens here through a bunch of symbolism that Kafka shows within his literature, we see that he opens the scene giving this grim like setting. He talks about the fog outside of the window, and as Gregor looks out the window now in his transformed body, he sees the window and how it's been raining, and it gives this type of sad type of setting. And this is essentially what, in Freud's theory, we believe that the subconscious is like. So the metamorphosis is a shift from the real world or the consciousness of Gregor into the subconscious, where we can see his feelings of guilt and resentment towards his family that he did not really know about himself. So now that Gregor is unable to provide for his family, that he's an insect, he must rely on them. He can't do anything by himself, and now he sees that he is of no value to them, now that he can't give them money or even financial stability. And now, you know, his only job in his family is over because he doesn't have a purpose anymore. And this takes a huge toll on Gregor. And he's now confused about his meaning in life. What is he supposed to do now? After living through this routine life, going every day on and on, living the same life, waking up, going to work, coming back home, just to do it all over again. This routine made him feel safe and comfortable within his own life. So now, in this metamorphosis that he had, this shift from a human state into the insect state, it took a huge toll on him. He was scared, and he didn't know what to do with his life now. The second aspect to consider is the human desires portrayed through the literature. In the beginning of the story, we see that Gregor immediately disregards the fact that he was turned into an insect and focuses on the main point that he is unable to go to work, and he worries about how he's going to provide for his family. He thinks about how he's never missed a day of work and how his boss and how everybody else at his job will be affected by this. Now, Gregor is a traveling salesman, which means that he basically did not really have much of a life outside of work and outside of his home life. So the only social interaction that he would have would either be at his job with the people that he worked with or with his family. It didn't give him much room to explore other relationships in his personal life. So he focuses on his boss and how he will react to him being unable to go into work. And to make matters worse, his boss, the head clerk, actually goes and shows up to his house and demands to see Gregor. And Gregor is clearly visibly upset, and he hasn't even showed his family that he is not a human anymore. He is scared beyond his imagination. He's worried about what's going to happen. He's scared about how he's going to disappoint his boss, and he worries that maybe this is the end of it. And actually, he gets fired because he is unable to go to work. Secondly, he worries about how his father is going to take this. And it focuses specifically on the father because Gregor holds him up to a higher standard. With Mr. Samsa, Gregor's father, being the man of the house, he worries that he is not holding up to his standards. Now that Gregor was the provider of his family, he was the breadwinner, he would bring food to the table, something that his father could not do. So that being his only job, he worried that now that this was gone, he wouldn't have a purpose, that his father would now think of him as you know, a nuisance, which at the end he does. So why did Gregor have such a concern regarding his job rather than his transformation? Why was this such a huge concern in his mind? In the literature, it specifies very specifically on how Gregor stresses this point about not being able to go into work. He quickly thinks about how this is going to affect the other people around him. He barely thinks about himself. He doesn't have much time to think about himself. If you're a main provider in the family, you know that the struggles of having to go to work every day, not missing a shift, or even picking up extra shifts at work, because you know the effect that this will have on your family. And now that this is gone, the only purpose that he had, now he is confused. He doesn't know what to do with himself. He's left alone, and he simply is asking himself, what now? Am I going to return into my human state? How long is this going to last? He asks himself these questions throughout the literature. And Kafka clearly points this out, that his concern changes from, when am I going to return to my human form? And it shifts to, am I even human anymore? So this is actually a shift from where he thinks about, when am I going to return to being human, to, am I still human? And one of the points in the story where this is being shown is when Gregor's mother and his sister Greta go into his room to try to remove furniture from his room in order to make it more accessible for Gregor. Now that he is a gigantic beetle and restricted to this small room throughout days and days, weeks after weeks, he needs to be more mobile. And in an effort to help him do that, his sister brings up the idea that maybe they should take out the furniture in his room. And at first, Gregor's okay with this. He feels comfortable with moving things out of the room. But then he sees them take everything out, and he starts to panic. And he strains this idea that, if everything is gone from my room, I'm being separated from the things around me, from who I was before this. Because Gregor doesn't think of himself as Gregor anymore. He thinks of himself as this disgusting beetle that's being neglected from everybody else, from his family, from society, not being able to contribute anything essential to his family. And so when they're removing the last pieces of furniture, Gregor clings himself to a portrait on the wall of a woman. And as he clings on this picture, it shows the last remaining human desire that he has, which is his sexual desire that he has towards this painting. His conscious mind was trying to remain human despite his current insect state. The attraction to the framed picture represents his desires as a human individual. However, his insect state prohibits him to feel as though he is human. They did so and stood. Oh, I can't see that. Oh. There we go. What is happening? Okay. My apologies. They did so and stood, their hands in the pockets of their somewhat shabby coats, around Gregor's corpse in the room where now it was fully light. This is a quote that's now showing Gregor's death, right? And Gregor's death is very specific, the way that Kafka led the events leading up to his death. At first, he gets into this confrontation with his father, and his father is filled with anger by Gregor and the things that are happening, that Gregor's not able to do anything for himself. And he immediately starts throwing apples at him, and one of them gets lodged in the side of his body. As the apple begins to rot, so does his body. And this is leading closer to his death. And Gregor's already having feelings of doubt, having being neglected from his family. He worries, like, does my family even notice me anymore? Do they care about me? Am I even important to them anymore? Am I a family member still? As moments go on, Gregor's family no longer sees him as their son or brother, but they see him as a beetle. They don't think that he has a human conscience anymore. They just think that he turned into a beetle and that's it. So they stop caring for him. They start bringing him food, and they don't clean his room anymore. They don't attend him as often as they used to. Well, as his sister used to. So now that we see that Gregor's death is leading up to towards the end of the story, he gets into another altercation with his family, where in this case, since the family had trouble paying things for the house, they had to take up 3 more tenants to live in the house. And as they were there, they wanted to hear Gregor's sister play the violin. And as she did so, Gregor heard this, and he wanted to be part of this nice moment, this nice family unity that they had. He wanted to even have a sense of this, since he hadn't, since he turned into an insect. And as he sits there in the corner, he tries to get closer, and the tenants freak out. And they use this as an excuse not to pay their rent. So now the family is without that money that they were going to receive from those tenants. And Gregor's father blames Gregor, and he is upset with him and screams and fights with his family and says that Gregor is a nuisance and that he essentially doesn't bring anything to the family anymore and that they should get rid of him. And of course, Mr. Sampson doesn't think that Gregor understands this. He's merely an insect. He doesn't comprehend this. This is not wrapping up in his brain. But Gregor understands every single thing that he's saying. And he takes this in. The thoughts that he had of his father not accepting him, the worry that he had, it was actually true. In the state of vacant and peaceful meditation, he remained until the tower clock struck 3 in the morning. This is the last thing that we hear about Gregor, about him and his death. He died alone in his room, without anybody around him, without his family members even caring about him. The last thing that he heard was that his family should get rid of him. After he heard this, he took himself to his room and he contemplated on life, if it's better to live in this life being cared for by his family, neglected his whole life, or to die and to get a release from this. But also, you would have to let go of all your human links to this world. So this was an internal conflict that Gregor was going through, whether to live or to die. And at his last moments, when he contemplated through this, he chose that it was better to die, because he felt that his family was never going to be happy after this. So he chooses to die, and once he dies, there's actually another point of symbolism that Kafka uses. When Gregor is dead in his room, his family comes in and looks at him. They surround him and look at him and his body there laying on the floor. And it says that the room fills with light, and then that they put on their coats, and then they start to leave the house. And they leave Gregor there. The house is vacant. And they just leave and act as if Gregor never existed, as if Gregor just left. And so Gregor's death, it means, wasn't just a release from his, physical state. It wasn't just a normal death that we all understand. It was a sacrifice that Gregor made. And this sacrifice was very important, because without this sacrifice that he made, his family would have never been able to reach self-fulfillment or had an opportunity to do so. Gregor was unable to do this, living a routine life, not having a life of his own, and giving up the chance to have a life of his own family, and working somewhere where he actually was appreciated, where his worth ethic was appreciated. He was never appreciated by his family, merely by his mother and his sister, but never by his father. And this affected him, and this has a correlation with how Kafka's relationship was with his father, and how in Kafka's life, his father resented him and never validated him for anything that he did. And this was shown in many pieces of literature that Kafka represented. And, it clearly shows it here in the Metamorphosis, and how Kafka actually felt in his whole life leading up to his death. So now, reaching the end, the main points that I wanted to talk about was essentially these 2 questions. Why are the changes presented in our own lives important? And why do we tend to value certain things more than others? By asking ourselves these questions, we have a chance to actually analyze them into our own lives. A metamorphosis is not always a bad thing. A change, a shift in our life, it doesn't always have to be leading up to a bad thing. This can lead to new opportunities that we have to go to. These changes might be things that we have to go through in order to reach something better in our lives. These sacrifices that we make, it may seem terrible right now, but at the end, it might result in something amazing, truthfully, something that you would never have seen yourself doing in the future. And us as college students, you know, we're often torn with choices like, what do we do after high school? What do we do after graduation? What is there to do now? Like, what do we do now that we lived in this routine life for 4+ years? We're presented with this huge step where we have to go into the grown-up world now, and we have to, you know, at times change the way that we think and the way that we present ourselves, the way that we interact with other people in our social groups. And, you know, by asking ourselves these questions, we keep ourselves in check. We understand why these shifts in our lives are important. We understand why they happened in the first place. What are they leading up to? And what pieces of these changes do we value the most? What is the biggest thing that we take out of this? And those are the main points that I think that Kafka was trying to present in his story, other than, you know, his family unit and how, you know, they all collided with each other, but also how a shift in our life may not be such a terrible thing, and how it can lead to amazing things in the future. So I hope you all take that into consideration into your own lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annie. That was wonderful. There's your references. Thank you. So we have, so what I'm going to do is I've been trying to keep it to about 20 minutes per person. So we have about 2 minutes, Annie. So you can stop sharing your screen for right now. And if you want to take a look at the chat, there was a couple of different questions. So Annie's email is on that slide, but you can also share it in the chat. So Annie, there was a couple questions that came up in here, and I agree, it was beautifully done. Not that I'm biased, since she's my student, but there's a few questions in here for you. So let me see, I'll see if I can pull out one. Well, one of the questions that I think, you know, that you and I have talked about, that Jessica asked you, is why was an insect chosen for the transformation?
An insect, right. Also in literature, I didn't mention it here, but also I am writing a written report on this analysis that I had. It's a longer version of this where more points are being made, but where I wrote about this in my own paper, my own research that I did, the bug is never specified in this story. Kafka never actually says which type of beetle it is, but he stresses more on the points that, you know, it's, I guess if you had to imagine what type of beetle it would be, it would have to be like, so I'm trying to look for the right word, but maybe like a dung beetle or something like that, or something with like a hard, long back, because he stresses on the point that he is unable to get up from his bed at first, and then has struggles like mobilizing himself throughout his room. So this has a correlation with Gregor's mental health, and it tells us how living in this routine life, it led him to having, you know, depression with signs of like him being unable to get out of bed, which is why I think that Kafka chose this specific, you know, insect. He chose an insect out of everything that else that he could have chosen, because, you know, an insect it's looked as, you know, something insignificant, something that's unimportant, just a random bug that's there. But Kafka chose to put an emphasis on this type of creature and took it into respect to Gregor's life, and how the inabilities that are presented with the regular insect are presented and correlated with Gregor's mental health, and how, you know, it changes, and how he realized that he actually had, you know, some type of, you know, mental illness when it came to his metamorphosis.
Thank you, Annie. So, so again, you can look back to the chat, Annie, and if you want to respond to anyone directly, feel free. But I'm going to turn the floor now over to our second presenter of the morning. So that is Samantha. So Samantha, you can feel free to share your screen. And the way that I'm doing it, just so you know, is I'll give you a 5-minute warning and then a 2-minute warning, and then you'll still have a minute or two to go through any questions that pop up in the chat. And I want to thank everybody for putting their questions in the chat. I think that helps keep the conversation moving. So moving to our second presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Samantha Paucar. I want to thank you so much for your attention. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how religion is approached in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. I believe that Bronte's work comments on the spiritual emptiness of a cultural Christianity by making it so that Heathcliff and Catherine, who are by all means these sinful social outcasts, by making it so that they experience a salvation and a spiritual experience that is unique to themselves, but can be interpreted as a form of heaven and a form of spirituality all the same. So Wuthering Heights is a novel about a tumultuous romance between Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw. Heathcliff has no last name. After hearing Catherine's decision to marry the rich Edgar Linton, Heathcliff runs away from home, only to return 3 years later to cruelly enact revenge upon his childhood oppressors and reunite with Catherine. So this novel involves a spectrum of personalities, really intense interfamilial drama, passionate love, and even more passionate hate. And so some people are under the impression that it's quite a miracle that someone like Emily Bronte could have written a novel like this. According to popular thought, she lived a very sheltered life. Above and to the left is an image of her home, Haworth Parsonage, in the 19th century. And that the conception is that she had very few friends outside of her family, very few interactions. She's seen as a recluse. And so it's like, how could someone who had so little life experience write a novel like this? And what some people forget is that she was a very educated woman who read vastly, and her hometown was something of a cultural center with concerts, lectures, and a literary newspaper. And at Haworth Parsonage, where she lived, there was a large circulating library, where she would have had access to lots of different genres of books that she could have learned from and that could have influenced her own writing. So I want to explain Wuthering Heights as the product of a rich and complex internal world, a critical mind, and an immense imagination, not a random miracle. Daughters of the clergy, which Emily Bronte and her sisters were, their father was a clergyman, they were often expected to find work caring for others, such as the elderly or the sick. However, unlike her sisters, Emily completely rejected this and focused solely on with the majority of her time on her studies and writing. So Wuthering Heights is really the product of someone wanting to push boundaries in literature and even in their own life. Thinking that this always reminds me how our internal worlds are just consistently more potent than the circumstances that are surrounding us at present. And I hope you'll come out of this presentation enjoying Wuthering Heights for this reason. Her education was largely a result of her father, Patrick Bronte, which I mentioned earlier. He was a pastor, and this is the image of the church that he worked at. To the right is an image of some Franz reenacting Charlotte Bronte's wedding. Patrick Bronte was unlike the evangelical parents of the time because he gave his children intellectual and religious freedom. They were able to read what they wanted. They weren't forced into any denomination of Christianity. In this household, there was an emphasis on how faith should be, to quote Patrick, a living force within the individual, rather than a set institution or set of beliefs and dogma. And this is so evident in Bronte's focus on spiritual experience in Wuthering Heights and what it means to experience something greater than yourself. It's also very clear in how throughout this novel, she spurns anything that appears dogmatic, anything that appears to attach rules to spirituality. So Bronte, as we established, was raised very differently from the way that Sunday schools and other institutions were raising up children and religious people. These institutions were hard set on indoctrinating people with beliefs and certain rules for spiritual hardiness. These beliefs and guidelines tended to be good for becoming acceptable and contributing members of society, conveniently enough. For example, one common saying was, "Always have a cheerful demeanor, for an ill-humored child makes God unhappy." So that's interesting because you get a sense of judgment and expectation here. And also behind this kind of innocuous sounding phrase, you're going to make God unhappy, there's like this real threat of hell behind that. So you definitely get a sense that being a good Christian has a lot to do with how you navigate life in society and how you present yourself and how others see you. The conception of salvation described by these institutions could easily be encompassed by the story of Reverend Griffin and the sailor, and that's why that little sailor picture is there. So basically, the sailor was set to be killed for attacking a police officer while drunk. And so, but the Reverend was able to get him pardoned. And astounded by this act of kindness, the sailor gives his life to Christ and becomes an upstanding man of business. And this is just always very amusing to me because, you know, the sailor has this incredible spiritual revelation, and that kind of just leads him to becoming a man of business, a real cog in the machine, if you will. So salvation is equated with social mobility, social acceptance. You see that the Christian person is not only rewarded in the afterlife, but also on earth in terms of material gain and social standing. So you definitely get a sense of that reduction of spirituality from religion. Heathcliff and Catherine are decidedly bad people. They're social outcasts, and every possible thing that they could have against them, they do. Heathcliff is darker in complexion, his ethnicity is ambiguous, and Catherine is an unruly woman living in a strict Victorian society. So they never become fully acclimated into society. Because of that, they can't fit into that Victorian narrative of where the good Christian is also a contributing member of society, is also someone respectable, is also someone that belongs. As children, they spend so much time exiled from Wuthering Heights, hiding from their older brother Hindley's wrath and abuse, and they spend a lot of the time outside in the rain, playing, and in one way or in many ways, they remain these children for the rest of their lives. For example, Heathcliff becomes a wealthy man, but he's still spurned by other wealthy people. He still lies and he cheats. He hangs small dogs. He forcibly adopts his enemy's son and then deprives him of an education. He has these illicit meetings with Catherine while he is a married man and she's a married woman. And the same is true for Catherine. You know, she's an equal participant in these meetings, and she is married to the richest man in the neighborhood. And her new high-class family fears her emotional volatility, and they walk on eggshells around her. So you see how neither of them really has a place or belonging. And as we established, that really removes them from that narrative that we were discussing. And not only do they not fit in with this idea of salvation that we're getting from institutions, but they also subvert this idea that Victorian ethics are at all spiritually and morally superior, through the fact that their deaths as sinners reflect the biblical Christian narrative that we see in things like the Great Flood, the Crucifixion, the Apocalypse, with all that same intensity, and with all that same intensity of like spirituality and spiritual experience. And it does so much better than the practical mundaneness of a sailor retiring from crime and finding a new career in business. And the Christian narrative essentially has this basic plot line where suffering and destruction leads to peace. And we see that reflected in their deaths because they have these protracted, painful deaths that ultimately do lead to an afterlife of sorts. Heathcliff and Catherine both opt to starve themselves to death, and both of those deaths exhibit a great gruesomeness as their bodies and minds escape them. Heathcliff becomes goblin-like looking, and we have a quote there to describe that. His eyes become bloodshot. He appears that he's going blind with loss of sleep. So you really get a sense of that just total deterioration of his body. And Catherine herself becomes so thin and wasted that she can't recognize herself in the mirror. She looks in the mirror and is like, who's that hag in my room? And it's her. So you definitely see these people just deteriorating over a long period of time. But that does eventually end up leading to a real definite peace that they experience. So that peace is evident in Heathcliff and Catherine's afterlife. A shepherd boy, along with many other people, describes seeing the ghosts of Heathcliff and a woman walking around the moors on rainy nights. The beauty of this is that this is their own personal heaven. They're alone together in the rain, just as they were in their childhoods. The fact that this is their heaven is alluded to when Heathcliff is dying, and he says, I have nearly attained my heaven, and that of all others is unvalued and uncoveted by me. So these people who are bad Victorians, bad Christians, selfish people are able to enter their own personal heaven. And the salvation that Heathcliff and Catherine experience is so judgmentless because of this, that because of the things that they had done in their past, they aren't punished, but they're allowed to be together at the end, despite everything. And so there's something very merciful and very freeing about that. the fact that the Christian narrative is revived so powerfully without any reference to one's relationship to societal expectation highlights Bronte's commentary on the dull state of the cultural Christianity of the time, but also a sense of subjectiveness in terms of what it means to be spiritual, what it means to be saved. Maybe it's really just believing in something greater than yourself. Maybe it's something that gives you a reason to go on, like Heathcliff and Catherine do for each other. That's pretty much all for me. The best thing about working on this project has been able to really interact with this novel and put my finger on what draws me to and what has drawn millions of people to this novel. Definitely, it struck me as so mysterious upon my first reading, and it still has so much mystery to it, but it feels really, really gratifying to be able to understand at least the element of it that really drew me to it, and also to interact with this idea of isolation as well, especially in this time where we are so especially connected to our devices, our phones and laptops during this pandemic. I really hope that, you know, as seeing that we can see that through this work, through Wuthering Heights, and how it also touches on this real sense of isolation between these people. I hope that we can learn that literature can be used as a means of understanding ourselves, connecting with ourselves, and also connecting with others. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Samantha. That was excellent. Very, very good. So one of the things that I'll just say is I think, you know, and there's one question in the chat for you, which we can get to, but if there's any other questions, we have a little extra time for questions for Samantha following her presentation. But one of the things that I see for sure, just between you and Annie, for instance, you know, you guys are both looking at how like your characters, you know, mirror the everyday world and how we can relate to those characters. So I already see connections between like our panelists, which I always love to see when we do presentation. So one of the things that I saw in the chat for you was, do you feel there's a modern day twist of Romeo and Juliet, the themes of Romeo and Juliet in this story?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely see that. Like, Catherine actually dies because of, I feel like that is similar to Juliet, and that she dies because she can't be with Romeo, and also because I believe that she thinks that Romeo has died. And so it's different in that sense, but Catherine ultimately decides to kill herself via starvation because of the fact that she cannot choose between her husband and Heathcliff, because they're both integral to, well, Heathcliff is integral to her identity, and Edgar is this one little piece of, you know, belonging, like a very weak sense of belonging that she has into this Victorian society. So that's definitely an element of that. And Heathcliff, I think, is more close to a Romeo type figure, although not, because he kills him. He decides to die 18 years after Catherine has died. And he only does so after revenge just no longer has any kind of appeal to him. So that is the reason that he ultimately begins to decide to just stop eating. And he's also moved by a kind of intense fervor.
Great. And I mean, everyone else who's here can also feel free to unmute themselves if you want to say something to Samantha, but you brought up the starvation, and Dr. Radford had actually asked, I had forgotten that they starve themselves. Is there a parallel with saints here? And then another question also brings up the quote with my heaven. So like, I think, you know, if you can comment on those things, that would be great.
Yes, let me just try and find that that question.
So the first one is, yeah.
So yeah, definitely I do see a connection to sainthood, especially, you know, Emily Bronte also, there is like, I think that she was also a religious person and would partake in like fasting, but there's like some rumor that she might have taken it to a point of like being sort of an anorexic. So I'm seeing that there as well. And I see it as like definitely a kind of, there's definitely that connotation of purification in starving yourself. And that's definitely evident in Wuthering Heights, in that they have to, you know, make this sacrifice of completely removing themselves from the things of this world. Like they ignore that need to eat. And that's like a worldly kind of need. So they kind of completely disattach themselves to what is considered human. And they definitely descend or ascend into something that is more spiritual and holy, in that they are ignoring the needs of their bodies and focusing solely on the needs of their souls, and the needs of their souls is, each other, as is referenced to throughout the novel.
Great. Let's see. So there's like, after that question, there was maybe one or two more. If you want to tackle, we can do another 2 or 3 minutes before we move to Kylie.
Yeah, one of the quotes does say "my heaven," and I think that throughout this novel, there's a real focus on subjectiveness. So I would say that "my heaven" is a more personal thing than a strict collective and strict belief, and that would definitely be reflected through Emily Bronte's own perception of religion. In her poetry, she discusses feeling trapped by religion at times, and how trapped by the fact that the only way that she can feel, this spiritual ecstasy is through God. And she definitely explores this idea of wanting to find a spiritual satisfaction that is separate from God, separate from nature, but that can just exist within whatever it is that you want it to exist in. And, she definitely is exploring this idea of choice of God in Wuthering Heights and within her personal poetry as well.
And the last question is from Jessica.
Okay. How do you think Heathcliff and Catherine's happy ending impacts the hopeful ending of the surviving generation? Yeah. I want to say that definitely is, because, okay, so for background, Hareton is Catherine's nephew, and her daughter, also named Catherine, but we'll refer to her as Kathy. Kathy teaches Hareton to read, which I feel like is symbolic of, breaking that abuse, and that Heathcliff subjected him to not being able to read, not being able to go to school. But Kathy takes that time with him to teach him how to read, and together they become less of these, I guess, gruff, very violent and archaic almost people, and kind of entering civilization and something more gentle, something more soft. So that's one element of breaking the cycle of abuse. And Heathcliff and Catherine's happy ending, the fact that they are able to experience a heaven together, and they're no longer pressured by these societal constraints, and they're also buried together, which also shows how they're no longer under the control of societal constraints, and the abuse that they kind of faced as a result of societal constraints also indicates that they are freed of that cycle.
Awesome. Great. Well, those are some awesome answers and some really great questions from our audience. So so it's 11:15, so we have one more presentation, and then there should be some time, not just for Q&A for Kylie, but across the panel if we'd like. So Kylie, I'm going to turn the floor over to you next, okay? So you can share your screen, and again, I'll keep time for you. But this is a great session. I've been enjoying like all of your perspectives on everything.
Okay. Great. Can you see my screen?
I can see your screen. I don't know if, oh, there it goes. Now it's loading. Okay, I can see you. All right. So it looks like you're having a little connection issue. I don't know.
Okay.
You're a little delayed. So
Yeah, it keeps telling me my connection is unstable.
okay.
So if I start glitching out or something, please let me know in the chat or something.
No problem. I'm going to see if I can pull you. I'm going to see if you can get started. I'm going to see if I can pull your slides. Did you submit them to the form?
Oh no, I didn't. So okay.
All right, so if you
I
want,
can now.
one of the things that you could do, Kylie, and let me just I'll put it, this is my email address. So if you want to email your slides to me, like download a PDF and send them to me. If you glitch out, I can always display them on my end for you.
Okay. you want me to start doing that, to email them to you now, or do you want me to just do it if I glitch out?
I think you're good right now. You're coming through clearly, so I think we're good to go.
Okay. All right. Well, sorry about that. Thank you for being patient with me. Hi, everyone. It's so good to be here talking about this. I'm so excited to share my research, and it's a tough act to follow. I had 2 wonderful presentations to sit through, and I hope I can do my topic some justice. So today I'm going to be talking about the topic that I wrote for my undergraduate thesis, which is I kind of titled Living Statues in Collapsing Kingdoms, Shakespeare and the Forgotten Epidemic. And mine's, I guess, a little bit more medical, a little bit more scientific than the previous presentations, but I hope it will still be somewhat interesting. So right here, if you can see this picture, this is actually an illustration of inflamed tissue in a monkey's brain. And so how does this relate to Shakespeare? Hopefully I can explain. So before I get into the literary, discussion, I need to kind of give a background of this disease. So throughout the winter of 1916 to 1917, there was a disease that started appearing out of the blue, and it had the most peculiar symptoms that anyone had ever seen. It had caused people to fall asleep for days at a time. They would just be so overwhelmed with fatigue that they could not do anything else but sleep. And, this was very disturbing because nobody had seen anything like it. But another thing about this disease is that it caused people to simultaneously be very, have very extreme insomnia. So there was like 2 main strands of the disease. You would either get the extreme sleepiness or the extreme insomnia. And so people didn't know if this was the same disease or not because it had such contradictory symptoms. And something else that scientists noticed about the disease at this time was that it was really made worse by any sort of emotional disturbance. If there was any sort of emotional upset in a person's life, it could cause them to develop this disease and to fall asleep for weeks. And in the later stages of the disease, the most severe, some people fell asleep for decades, and they became sick in the early 1920s, the late 1910s, and they didn't wake up from this until the 1960s. So they were just in this frozen state of sleep for so many years. They lost so many years of their life. And so nobody knew what to call this disease. Nobody knew how to stop it until one scientist by the name of Constantine von Economo, he did some research, as I showed in my first slide with them. He did research on monkeys' brains, and he noticed that that this disease caused inflammation of the brain. So he called it encephalitis, which is brain inflammation, and then lethargica, which is after the extreme fatigue that it causes. So encephalitis lethargica had its most brutal outbreak in 1917, but there is some evidence to suggest that this might not have been the first outbreak of it throughout history. And in fact, there could have been one in Shakespeare's time in 1580. And when I heard about that, I was determined to prove the existence of this disease back in Shakespeare's time, because I just thought it was so fascinating to learn about the history of this disease and how we can use literature as a tool to learn about the history of medicine. So here is just an illustration of the patients that here. And these people are just photographed in their state, their frozen state. They would just be lifeless for long periods of time. Hospitals would have entire wards just filled with sleeping people. And they couldn't do anything, and they could just wait for them to wake up. And then in some of the more severe cases, patients developed Parkinson's-like symptoms, where they would have tremors, uncontrollable tremors. They would become, their bodies would be contorted. As you can see, these men here, they would be stuck in these very painful positions, and they couldn't move. So I was very interested to see if there was some evidence of this disease within the literature of Shakespeare's time. So that's why I took to looking at some of Shakespeare's plays, and I wanted to see, can I find evidence of encephalitis lethargica from around 1580? And so that is where my quest began. So for my argument in my paper, I just said that, I was basically posing the question, why does no one remember this epidemic? People are talking about, pandemics throughout history now, especially with coronavirus, but nobody seems to mention encephalitis lethargica. And it was huge. It affected 5 million people. And I was just wondering, why does no one know about it? And how come there's no literature written about it? So using, Shakespeare's works, I knew that Shakespeare had accurately described medical phenomenon. He had a reputation for medical accuracy. There's many sources that will back that up. So I thought, well, Shakespeare would be a reputable source to see if, anybody in the Renaissance knew about this disease, even if they didn't necessarily know the name of it or the exact, scientific origin. So I was looking through this database online called Early English Books Online, EBO, and I was trying to find, any sort of book, any sort of, research paper from Shakespeare's time that would give me evidence of this disease. And finally, I found something. And this is from The Method of Physic by the Dr. Philip Barrow from 1583. And he describes a condition called apoplexia. And he says every part of the body doth suddenly lose both moving and sense, or it is a depriving both of sense and moving throughout the whole body, coming suddenly with hurt of all voluntary functions. So to me, this description of the depriving of both sense and moving could be attributed to encephalitis lethargica, because he goes on to say, they that fall into this disease do lack sense altogether. They lie as they were asleep with their eyes shut and do snort. So the fact that they're like literally asleep reminded me so much of this disease. And in support of the idea that it is an epidemic rather than just, a non-communicable disease, he says that if it invade a young person, and that in summer season, it is most perilous. So it's not just people, affecting one group of people. It can affect the young, the old, and especially if it occurs during the summer season, it's an indication that it spreads during one specific time of year. So to me, that is an indication that this apoplexy could be, I can't say for sure, obviously, but it could be a sign of encephalitis lethargica. So now this is where Shakespeare comes in. So I looked at The Winter's Tale, and The Winter's Tale is basically, I'll try to give a very short summary, basically a story of a king and a queen, and the queen is pregnant, but the king, Leontes, is very jealous, and he has this idea that his wife has been cheating on him. So he thinks that his unborn child is illegitimate. So when the child is born, he has it thrown out in the woods to be eaten or by the wild animals. And in the meantime, the Queen Hermione is very upset about what is happening, to her husband. She doesn't understand why her husband is treating her this way. And their young son, the Prince Mamilius, he is so overwhelmed by the emotional turmoil between his parents that he literally dies. He is so overwhelmed that he can't take it. So Hermione also becomes very overwhelmed, and she swoons and faints, and her the people of the court declare that she's dead. But as we can see, she actually did not die from fainting. She was alive. And she was hidden by her lady in waiting. And as she was hidden, it was revealed that her unborn baby actually had not been abandoned in the wilderness. She had survived, and she had been taken in by a shepherd. And so 16 years later, after the queen, quote unquote, dies, but actually faints, she is brought back to the court as a statue. And as you can see here, this is the Queen Hermione, and she's being revealed as a statue. And her husband thinks that she's dead, and this is just a statue. But it is revealed that Hermione is alive, and after her husband repents, she comes back to life. As you can see here, she's kind of in this half alive, half dead state right here. And this idea of a human statue reminded me of encephalitis lethargica, the living statues that were caused by this disease. So I just wanted to make a case study, first of all, of the Prince Mamilius, because when he, he gets sick, he says that, he says that he threw off his spirit, his appetite, his sleep, and downright languish. He had no appetite. He could not sleep. That reminded me of the insomnia that is caused by the disease, and how it completely altered the victims, brain patterns, their personalities. And because it is said that the encephalitis lethargica victims died of insomnia, literally staying awake for days before their bodies gave out. So that reminded me of Mamilius. And then another thing about Mamilius is that the fact that he died because he was so overcome with emotion from what was happening to his mother, how his mother had been blamed for adultery. So to me, the circumstances surrounding his death, the fact that he got sick because he was so upset, the fact that he died because he stayed awake for days and until his body gave out, to me that seems very similar to encephalitis lethargica. And again, I can't say for certain. There's no way for me to officially diagnose him, but I think it is a possible diagnosis. So next we have Hermione. And Hermione, she is again, she seems to die after she's accused of adultery. She faints, and it says that she is dead, I swear it. And she appears to have no sense of life within her, which is just like the victims of this disease. They appear to be completely and utterly dead to the world. And another thing is that because Hermione was not actually dead, she was just sleeping or hidden away for 16 years until she was brought back as a statue. To me, that reminded me of how the encephalitis lethargica patients could be asleep for decades, and then one day they would just have this miraculous awakening, just like Hermione had. So to me, considering her emotional turmoil, her death-like appearance, and her ability to resume her life, there is significant basis of evidence with encephalitis lethargica. And then what does this show about mother and child mutual dependency? What does this tell us about the play? Because it's one thing to just talk about the medical aspect, but it's another thing to bring in the more literary analysis. And to me, I think it shows that mother and child depend on each other. And for Hermione, she was so upset that her son died, Mamilius died, and that her unborn daughter was taken away from her, that she fainted and she died. She could not live without her children. And Mamilius, he also dies because he could not live without his mother. So this contagious disease that is spreading throughout the kingdom, to me, reminds me of having the mutual symbiotic relationship that is expressed within the characters of this play. Okay, so I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to just skip to my conclusion here, because I actually discussed this in another play, which is Henry IV, Part 2. But I'm going to skip through that because it is it's a lot, and I'm not going to be able to cover it in 2 minutes. But what I will say is that just in a short summary, basically in Henry IV Part 2, the king is afflicted with this mysterious disease, which is also called an apoplexy. And as he is dying of this apoplexy, it's described as a, it's described as a sleeping in the blood. And to me, that really reminds me of the sleeping sickness, which is what encephalitis lethargica was called in Shakespeare's time, or and throughout history before it had an official name. So I suggest in the following half of my argument that the king is afflicted with encephalitis lethargica, and as the head of the country, because he is diseased, his disease is spreading throughout the entire kingdom. It's a moral disease, it's a decay of the country. And it is not until the king dies and his son Hal, who becomes Henry V, takes over, that the health of Britain can be restored, because when the head of the country is sick, then the rest of the country is sick from this apoplexy. And to me, that is the, I guess, symbolic meaning of encephalitis lethargica within Henry IV Part 2. So basically, for my conclusion, I will just say that studying this disease in the context of these plays can really not only show the history of this disease, because nobody knows very much about it, but it can also kind of lend a new meaning to these plays and show the relationship between father and son, mother and child, all of these things, and how parents and children depend on each other. So with that, I will conclude my presentation. I hope it was somewhat interesting for you. Thank you so much.
No, I think it was extremely interesting. Everyone was just like, I think at one point in the chat, everyone's like, "Oh my gosh, this is so interesting. This is I can't believe this, And I think it's just an interesting way of making literature more than just being literature, right? Bringing the science into it, and literature is very interdisciplinary in nature. But I love that your presentation took that on. So I'm going to invite people to definitely use the chat right now. But we have just about 10 minutes left in our session. So if there's any questions for Kylie, and I'm sorry that you had to skip over your second play. And I did keep the time to 18 minutes per person, and I appreciate that. But, presenters, if you also want to put your emails in the chat, if you guys want to share contact info, that would be great. But would anyone like to open up their mics or ask a question to Kylie?
There's a terrific question in chat, but maybe I'll ask my question super fast.
That would be great.
Because it's kind of about all three. So all three presentations were in one way at least talking about a kind of maybe a tiredness or spiritual emptiness or a loss of connection to the real world that precipitates some radical removal from it. And I think that's a fair way to kind of bring all three of your stories together. What do you think the kind of symbolic or meaning implications of this are for each one of your texts? Like why maybe go back to the question of like, why is there this removal from the world? There.
Great question. So Kylie, maybe since you haven't had a chance to answer a question, you could start if you have something to say.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I was definitely noticing the similarities between my the themes in my plays, even though they're very different from, the other texts that were discussed. And I think that being removed from the world, especially with Hermione from The Winter's Tale, it can show a lot about, again, as I was talking about, like the importance of children in her life and for her as a character, which I think was quite interesting for, a Renaissance text, because back then children were kind of not, looked at as, second class citizens. They weren't really taken into much consideration. So for this text to show that Hermione was removed from the world for 16 years, and the thing that kept her going was the thought of her children and the thought that her lost daughter was out there somewhere. I think that is really powerful, I guess, display of motherhood.
Annie or Samantha want to tackle that question?
Sure. Well, with my my literary analysis, I thought that the shift from the world, as Miss Radford was talking about, it signifies something very, very different. Well, like how within the subconscious we're able to see the thoughts that we're not able to process normally, or the things that are, we think about deep in the back of our head that we don't really, we're not able to express fully. But throughout the story, we're able to see how, his repressed feelings for his father and for his family, the thoughts that he never thought about leaving his family or making a life of his own, those were things that he simply just thought about in the back of his head, but never would actually, act on it. So, it shows how much we think about, but that we'll never actually be able to do in our own lives or portray through our lives. So I thought that was a very significant part of, the other world, which, in this case was the subconscious mind.
Yeah, to touch on that a little, something that I think is really interesting that I think Annie phrased it like, things that we'd never be able to do. In Wuthering Heights, I feel like there's a lot of wish within the novel, and I think when a lot of art, you get like a sort of wish fulfillment from like the artist, and also we can read it and see one of our wishes fulfilled. In that, something that Catherine Earnshaw says is, what would be the use of my creation if I was to just be contained here, like in her body, in this society where there's all these constraints and rules about how she's supposed to behave, and and where she can't be allowed to love Heathcliff in the way that she does, because of just their differences in terms of how he's seen as the other. He's not an acceptable person to love. So I feel like there's a lot of that sense of wanting to escape just like the box that sometimes we're like put into. There's definitely a desire for more, for transcendence, for a transcendent experience. And that's something that we experience in our daily lives so much. And I think that's a beautiful thing about literature, is that when you read books, you feel that sense of being stifled. Like you can experience how the characters are stifled and how they're just like bursting out of their skin almost in order to touch something that is real. And to experience something that feels real. So that's, and yeah, it's like we'd never be able to experience, dying in these insane ways and then becoming ghosts and having an afterlife like that. Like we can experience that, but the feeling of it and reading that is just so freeing. You kind of live vicariously through these characters.
Great answers. There was a question directed to Kylie in the chat that I'll just call out, from Jessica. She said that, your presentation was really interesting. Medicine has a huge impact on literature of every era. I saw you had a chart about the 4 humors. Was there any reference to the 4 humors in terms of explaining the sleeping sickness?
Yeah, so that was a huge part of my argument for Henry IV Part 2, because the king's sickness is referred to as a sleeping in the blood. And blood back then was kind of the symbol of life in the humoral theory. It was like, it signified youth and vitality and, you know, and courage. And those are all things that, you know, if the king was lacking, obviously, because he had a sleeping in the blood, so his blood was not functioning as it should. So because he did not have adequate amount of blood in humoral theory, then his humors were imbalanced, and so the kingdom became you know, sickened because of his humoral imbalance. And versus the new king, Henry V, he is mentioned several times throughout the play to have, I guess, a healthy amount of blood. He's, you know, so he would be the person to restore England to health. And in terms of like medically back in Shakespeare's day, I can't say for sure exactly how it would be described humorally. A lot of the conditions were ascribed to melancholy, which is another humor. It was said that, you know, it was caused the sleeping, you know, the lethargy and the sleeping was caused by an excess of melancholy. So it is, you know, humoral theory appears both in medical text and in.
Great. Thank you. So we only have like 1 or 2 more minutes left. So maybe what I'll do is, you know, again, I want to thank all of our presenters this morning. I think that you guys did a great job, you know, exploring the literature that you guys, yes, I see hands up. So yes, if people want to turn on their cameras and give a round of applause, you know, it was fantastic. So let me just give you a little bit of information about how the rest of the day is going to run. Okay. So we will have, at 12 o'clock, so just right after this session, there is our keynote speaker who will be talking to you about her charitable organization, Pathways to Housing. So I think that'll be really great. Her organization is located in Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, where our next in-person conference is supposed to be. So a year from now, hopefully we won't be in little boxes, but we'll be in person and walking around the conference center with one another. So hopefully you can come and check out the keynote. For all my students in the room, okay, tonight at 8 o'clock, there is the Zoom dance party, okay? So make sure that if you can Zoom in for that, even if it's just for a short amount of time, I'm sure it'll be something fun and entertaining. The student representative Taylor has worked really hard on that. Of course, we still have 2 more sessions of presentations this afternoon. And the other thing that I'll just say is, because all of you guys are writing papers and doing your research, if anybody wants to submit their paper for consideration to the NRHC undergraduate journal Illuminate, I just put the link in the chat if you want to check that out. So I want to encourage you to take your work even beyond today and consider submitting to Illuminate. So I want to thank everyone once again for coming to this session. It was a pleasure to hear from Annie and Samantha and Kylie. Congratulations on your presentation, and I look forward to seeing you guys in all different Zoom rooms throughout the weekend. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.